When I would talk to other colleagues about that, sometimes they'd be like, okay, Camie, we have to keep the dark side under the radar. We don't want people to know about the dark side. And I kept thinking, I'm not sure if that's true. I think we have to be real about it, and we have to realize we need to change. We shouldn't have this dark side that has to fly under the radar. So that was what I was trying to tell these equine scientists is this is happening. We can't just put our ostrich head in the ground. We have to be attentive to it.
Hi everyone, Mita here. Welcome to another episode of Changing Rein. Our guest this week is Dr Camie Heleski. Camie teaches on the Equine Science and Management program at the University of Kentucky. And before that, she was coordinator of the horse management program at Michigan State University for 25 years. Camie grew up on a small Arabian breeding farm. She's worked with thoroughbreds. She has had wide exposure to lots of different disciplines within the horse world. She's also a past president of the International Society for Equitation Science. So she's a very interesting guest to interview. One of the main topics we cover is the thorny topic of social license to operate. I know when we talk about that, a lot of people just balk and don't want to hear anymore because it's quite a nebulous concept. When I hear it, I think of the Joni Mitchell song, Big Yellow Taxi, where she sings, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I think that's probably true of social license. We won't know what we had till it's gone. So in this episode, we talk about a lot about that, and Camie talks about the struggles that people face when traditional practices maybe don't align with modern thinking. But she also talks about ways of dealing with that, and she's by nature, I think, an optimistic person, as are Karen and myself. So I think you'll enjoy this episode and we hope you'll take plenty away from it. I should also say that this episode was recorded before the Olympics in Paris, but I think the themes are universal and timeless. We hope you enjoy.
So, welcome to Changing Rein, Camie Heleski. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's really wonderful to be here. I was really fortunate to be born into a horse-owning family. My dad had a small Arabian horse breeding farm, so we had a few foals each year. We taught lessons. We trained horses of all different breeds. And, way before I realized my entire career would be on horses, I had this wonderful background of multiple breeds. And then later at Michigan State University, where I was taking classes, I went out to California, worked at a thoroughbred rehab farm. It turned out to be where Dwayne Lucas sent his rehab horses, which I had no idea how important that name was at the time. So I've had this really, really cool opportunity to be involved with a lot of different breeds, a lot of different disciplines, which dramatically helps when we're talking whether it's equine welfare assessment or social license to operate.
That does sound like such a great background to become a professor in equine science, Camie. You are very lucky. I was not so fortunate to be born into a horsey family, but I did manage to get a horse of my own eventually. But what a great background and founding for you. And you brought up a couple of topics in your introduction, one of which is really of interest to Mita and I, which is social license to operate. And one of the reasons that we invited you to come and talk to us on the podcast was your paper that you authored in 2023, which was specifically around social license to operate, which was pretty plain speaking for a academic paper, if I can say so. And I just wanted to read a sentence from the paper, which I think might be the final sentence from the abstract, which is the summary, which says, "This is real, this is a threat, and the horse industry should consider themselves put on notice." I wonder if you could just tease that out a bit for us. What was worrying you when you wrote that, and what was behind it?
Yes, it is a paper that allowed me more of my own personal opinions than a lot of scientific papers do. It was preparing for a presentation that I did at the Equine Science Society in June of 23, and I knew that I wanted to press some opinions and kind of shake up the conversation. And so I tried to incorporate that into the paper, and surprisingly, they allowed it. So, this has been many years where I've been thinking about social license. I just didn't know the term for it until I went to a conference where Julie Fiedler was presenting in 2017. And once I saw this idea of social license to operate, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what I've been thinking for a long time. I used to go to various horse shows. I showed a lot as a younger person. My daughter has shown a lot during her lifetime so far. And when you're there, you don't have your scientific hat on. So people don't know they should be careful about what they're doing. So they're just doing whatever they want. And you look around and it's like, that's a horrible way to treat a horse. That is a horrible way to treat a horse. And, when I would talk to other colleagues about that, sometimes they'd be like, okay, Camie, we have to keep the dark side under the radar. We don't want people to know about the dark side. And I kept thinking, I'm not sure if that's true. I think we have to be real about it, and we have to realize we need to change. We shouldn't have this dark side that has to fly under the radar. So that was what I was trying to tell these equine scientists, is this is happening. We can't just put our ostrich head in the ground. We have to be attentive to it.
And can you tell us a bit, what reaction did you get?
It was very interesting in that in 2023, it was extremely well received. Had I given the same talk 10 years earlier, I think people would have mostly turned their head and gone back to chatting to their seatmate. Definitely people have been way more open to hearing this message in the last few years compared to, maybe 10 to 15 years ago when I would talk about it. I felt like I was just like some crazy equine welfarist. And now people are much more aware this is real, and whether it's show horses or race horses or lesson horses or therapy horses, we need to be thinking about this.
And do you think that message is starting to filter down in sort of beyond the sort of scientific community?
In some regards, yes. And in other regards, no. When I think of the FEI, the International Equestrian Federation, and that they brought several of us on board for an Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission, that says to me that the high-level competition group is thinking about this very much. I had a chance a couple times to talk with David O'Connor and work with United States Equestrian Federation. And again, this is building momentum. And perhaps surprisingly to some folks, I see the racing world trying really hard to embrace social license to operate. And I've been fascinated. I was just last week at the Jockey Club Grayson Foundation Summit for thoroughbred racing safety and welfare. And it was such a well done presentation overall, especially as I compared to the first one I went to that was very defensive. This one was more saying, here's some things we've done, here's some things we still need to do. Now, I think there are certain sub-industries within the horse world that have a really long way to go, and there's always a chance they could even lose their social license.
Everything you're saying, Camie, resonates with me. I mean, I was an equine vet for 40 years and really didn't pay a whole pile of attention to welfare in the bigger, as a big concept. I just knew that I was doing my job and I was caring for the horses that were under my care. But then I could see the pressure mounting. I was also involved in external work on the regulatory side and on the governance side of racing in particular. And I could see the mood changing. And I remember giving a presentation about 6 years ago. And one of my slides was a hot-baked potato. And the idea was, who's going to grab hold of this hot-baked potato that is equine welfare? Because it just was being passed from one to another, but nothing was happening. I went back to college, I did a master's in animal welfare. It opened my eyes, and I just think the timing was so opportune because, as you say, it's an open door now, which it wasn't 6 years ago for me. So it's great to hear that the same is happening in the US as well.
Well, and it's like if I go to a thoroughbred farm in Ireland or I go to a thoroughbred farm in Lexington, Kentucky, I can ask questions of the stallion handlers, let's say, related to equine welfare. I'm not going to specifically say social license to operate, but I will ask them welfare questions. I will ask them the turnout protocol for the stallions, let's say, and they are prepared to give answers with some depth. So they have more training in this area, certainly, than maybe a decade ago, two decades ago.
Yeah, no, it's a good place to be. I mean, and as you say, there are certain subsectors, I suppose, that maybe haven't quite seen the light yet. I suppose my concern is that horse sport is horse sport at the end of the day. The modern pentathlon, people thought that was show jumping. When that happened. The general public don't necessarily differentiate between the different disciplines. So I think everyone needs to be playing their part. And probably, I'm not sure is it that we can only move at the pace of the slowest group in the room?
I don't know that I think that's true. I think the leaders in the horse industry need to move forward and hope we can drag along some of the slower pieces. If we wait for the slower pieces to catch up, we won't go fast enough for the general public.
Yeah. So one of the things that you mentioned in the paper was that, and I'm guessing this might have come a little bit from your experience with the Ethics and Wellbeing Commission, was that in the past organisations have tended to adopt the almost, like you mentioned, the defensive, we know better, we know horses, we're the experts, that kind of approach to addressing community concerns about horse welfare. And you mentioned in the paper that that's probably not going to be successful. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So there's been a general feeling in many sectors of the horse world that, okay, we just need to educate the public. They won't be upset with us if they know more about this situation. They don't understand that you have to be tough with horses. This is me putting a label on what they've been saying. And we really can't educate ourselves out of this. I mean, yes, it's great if we can educate our stakeholders to understand more about horse welfare assessment, more about ethical, critical thinking, but to try to say, okay, there's this practice that's a little questionable, let's say almost any of the tail modifications we could think of, and if we just tell people, if we just tell the public why we're blocking a tail, why we're setting a tail, why we're docking a tail, they'll be totally on board. And that's not going to be the way to save social license.
Reminding me there, Camie, of a paper you co-authored back in 2012 that I found really, really helpful during my studies. It was one you wrote with Raymond Anthony about ethical assessment being crucial to animal welfare assessment. You can't basically have one without the other, and you work through some of those tail modification examples. I just thought it was such a clear paper, and people think ethics is something really difficult to understand, really difficult to discuss, but actually it's just about writing down the options from the perspectives of the different stakeholders in a particular situation based on as much knowledge as you can gather. And you can solve most problems by taking that approach. So it's a paper I really, really enjoyed. And now I see, like, Madeleine Campbell has her ethical framework, and you even in that paper you talk about the importance of the affective state, which kind of, I know the 5 domains model was already being developed, but you put it down there.
It was nice that you reminded me a couple days ago about that paper, because it's been a few minutes since I looked at it closely. That was 2012. And I was working with Raymond Anthony out of Alaska, and he was incredibly helpful to put the strong ethical perspective on this. And like you just said, ethics doesn't have to be about knowing all the fancy big words, taking a long philosophy class on the different camps of ethics. When I'm teaching to my students, we really only do like one presentation on ethical assessment. And I talk a lot about common sense ethics. And, I think back to some of the like cartoons you watched as a child where there's like a good angel on one shoulder and then a little devil on the other shoulder, and they're bantering back and forth about which option you're going to choose. And I think the students really seem to grasp that. And then we weave it into other presentations. It's like, okay, here's a practice in the horse industry. Break this out through steps. Try to set your emotion aside for a moment. And how does your group feel about this particular practice? And, I want them to be okay with not using the fancy words, just being able to have some gut feelings about right and wrong.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that's lost. The people just don't sit back and think, is this right? Am I doing right by the horse by doing what I'm doing? I think it's really, really
Yeah, if you know when you started a practice that it like made you feel yucky, but over time you have a lot of people convince you about why that needs to happen. That thing we call cognitive dissonance, where at first you felt really badly about doing it, but you get told enough by important people in your life that it's okay or it needs to be done. And eventually you just like compartmentalize it away and go ahead and do the practice that you're not happy with. But, I see that happen over and over when I go visit various horse farms. For a long time when I was at Michigan State, I would have like 15 or 20 horse farms I needed to visit each year because our students were doing their internships there. So these folks didn't know that I had a strong interest in horse behavior or horse welfare. They just knew I was coming to check on my students. So sometimes they were wildly open about practices, whether training practices or aesthetic modifications that were going on there at the farm. And inside, my mind is going, oh my gosh, I can't believe you just told me that. But on the outside, I need to be like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. But all of these things I kind of think happened for a reason. And they were able to be stored in little file folders in my brain and be brought out as I had more information on how to deal with that.
So can you tell us, Camie, how do you deal with it?
In the moment or after the time?
Maybe both.
So, one example, I went to a farm. It was actually, our student was working in a different country, and I won't mention what type of horse, but there were a lot of troubling things in the barn. Some horses were fairly thin, super shiny, but fairly thin. Some of the horses had bloody mouths, blood in the corner of the mouths. Some of the horses had blood on their side where I knew the spurs had gone. And, you know, the students just walking me around, showing me all the horses, telling me their bloodlines, you know, expecting me to be very excited about the bloodlines. And then, to add insult to injury, roughly a week later, one of the owning partners contacted me. They wanted a letter of my support of everything that was going on at the farm because there was a divorce proceeding going on. And I had to write back, it's like, I absolutely cannot do that. I was very troubled by what I was seeing. And I just am not ethically comfortable doing that. So in the moment, like I said, it didn't seem right to be horrified at the moment. And sometimes I just need time to process what I've just seen. But afterwards, you know, it's like, why would they even remotely think that I could write a letter of support to how the horses are being maintained? And, you know, it's an example that I've used here, but I've used it multiple times with students also. So you hope you get some positive out of what was basically a pretty negative situation.
So one of the there you go. No, I was just going to ask. So one of the things that I have found a little troubling, not so much visiting barns or things like that, but in just sort of listening to quite high-level riders talk, is their constant need for more evidence that some of the practices are not okay. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I feel like there's lots of evidence, and yet there seems to be this almost insatiable need for more evidence.
Certainly that has been a frustration. You know, while we were doing the Equine Ethics and Wellbeing Commission, there were some things related to tack and some things related to bits and some things related to nosebands. And there is a lot of evidence on these items. And we have evidence that it is negatively impacting the horses. So to try to say, well, we still need more, you know, and you might find, you know, if you're talking about roll cure training, you're talking about folks that have done a meta-analysis on, I think it was like 80 studies that Ute Koenig van Borstel did. And such a high percentage showed negative impacts. There might have been a couple that showed, okay, it does stretch out muscles, or we didn't see it impact the respiration rate in this particular study. But when you have such a large number that are showing negativity, I don't understand why it's so hard for people to grasp that. So certainly that has been frustrating to get pushback in the strong face of evidence. You know, there are certain areas where, yes, we still need more research. But, you know, again, if I look at some of the studies that show lesions inside the mouth, why would we need more evidence still? You know, some of the studies they would like to see done, we're not even going to get through an ethics board. They're not going to allow us to whip a horse X number of times to say, okay, if you whip a horse hard enough to leave a welt, we have a problem. We're not going to get an ethics board to approve that study.
And what does that tell you? It tells you that common sense says that this intervention is going to be painful or is going to be deleterious in some way. These are experts in ethical appraisal, and they're going to say, no, that doesn't make sense to me. It makes me smile.
Yeah, Maddie Campbell has talked a lot with us about precautionary principle. Things like if something were to cause a human pain, we should assume that it would cause a horse pain, at least until proven otherwise. And again, there's just so much evidence that their tissues are extraordinarily similar to our tissues, and we shouldn't be imagining that a horse can't feel a lesion in their mouth, for example.
Could we move on to the barriers, I suppose, to this? I mean, we've talked about people wanting more studies, more scientific proof, but what about the more general, the fact that I suppose equestrian sport at the elite level is big business, and that perhaps that's where the reluctance to embrace these changes comes from, because people's pockets are going to be affected, whether it's reduced betting handle or whether it's reduced visitors to a show, or reduced numbers of participants, or and the fact that horses sell for big money if they win the big competitions, and maybe that's a barrier to people embracing change within horse sport.
I mean, certainly getting past tradition, this is how we've always done it, is very challenging. There are certain things I see happening that give me hope. If I go to the racetrack and go to the backside, 20 to 30 years ago, I would see horses getting only a small meal of really good quality hay in the morning, small meal of really good quality hay later in the evening. And so there was a lot of the day, there wasn't hay in front of them. And now anytime I go to the backside of a track, there is a big stuffed hay bag out in front of the stall. So they're putting their head and neck out to see other horses. They're eating that forage that's in front of them much of the time. So that's been a positive thing about moving beyond tradition. When I think I might have mentioned this a bit earlier, but in terms of stallion housing at thoroughbred breeding farms, whether it's Ireland, whether it's Lexington, there was a time when I saw those stallions spending a lot more of their day in a stall than I do now. It seems like we had this sweeping change where the majority of thoroughbred stallions are out, I would say in most cases, for at least half the day. So we have moved in a very positive direction. Now, there are a lot of segments that I'm not sure what evidence some of the show barns are waiting for to say we need to let these horses live a more natural life. If we think of Lauren Fraser's 3 F's, the friends, the forage, the freedom to move, I do feel like there are certain segments of the horse industry that haven't heard that, and or if they've heard it, they don't think it applies to their type of horse. So, I've often said, before I retire and or before I die, I want every high-level competition horse to be out of its stall in an at-liberty situation for at least a couple hours a day. And that would make me so ecstatic if that could happen.
And do you think there might be scope for the leisure horse, the non-professional side of the equestrian world to maybe push for change? To me, it seems like that's where a lot of these conversations are happening already. Can that have an impact? Did that have an impact in your FEI Wellbeing Commission work? The voice of the ordinary horse owner, leisure rider, someone who enjoys horses for their own sake and is not necessarily financially heavily invested.
So I'm going to try to come back to the leisure rider. I will mention one thing I push really hard with my students is to remind them, if they are ever in a position where they own some of these high-level horses, that they need to remember all the important things that horses need to you know, they need to drop in at training centers, for example, unannounced, and find out what's happening with their horse. Now, as far as the leisure riders, yeah, that's an interesting one, because like in terms of racehorses, they are sometimes the most vehement opponents, and I'm not quite sure why that is. I try to chat with them about that when I have an opportunity, and sometimes it's just what they happen to have access to for information. Certainly in their own barn, they should be thinking about, let's not do the weekend warrior thing. You know, the leisure rider that takes their horse out and suddenly rides it really hard on the weekend, but it gets no conditioning during the week. I think they need to recognize that that is also a welfare problem, even though we're not dealing with a high-level competitive athlete. Yeah, I've wondered different times, what is it that the owner of a trail riding horse, a backyard horse, what could they do to help embrace social license to operate more? And I think I'm still trying to figure out what that would be.
Yeah, one of my theories about racing versus other equestrian pursuits, I suppose, is that everyone in racing is invested financially, really. It's very hard to be involved in racing and not have a stake in the game, whereas in equestrian sport you can have a really, really enjoyable life with your horses and not necessarily be in it for a financial gain. So I think that frees up people to speak and say, you know, talk about a different way. I think potentially in the racing world that's a little bit harder to do, because you are jeopardizing your own livelihood potentially.
And there certainly are a lot of people that simply because of the money that is involved with the racing industry, they feel fairly toxic toward that whole money standpoint of the industry. Now, I would say, like, if I look at Lexington thoroughbreds from birth to death, I feel like their status of welfare is every bit as good as a lot of the show horses and a lot of the leisure horses I know about. But if somebody hasn't been around a lot of thoroughbreds, they don't always necessarily understand that. You know, our mares and foals are out on the pasture, running around, beautiful large pastures. You know, I think of the thoroughbred racehorse a lot like a border collie. They have been bred for so many generations with such a drive to do some sort of athletic task that they really do operate a little differently than a lot of the other horse breeds. So any horse that is decent at racing has a huge drive to move forward. And a long time ago, different chapter in my life, we had Arabian racing at Michigan State. The horses that did not want to race, that had not high motivation to go fast, they were not going to go fast. And that's why a lot of these horses, a lot of these thoroughbreds, if they don't have a big desire to go fast, a lot of them move on quickly to their second career. My daughter's horse is an off-the-track thoroughbred. He didn't even ever have a race. They could already tell, even though he was really well bred, he didn't have that motivation to go fast. So it's like, before he gets injured, let's just transition him to another career. Now, I'm not saying that every single part of the racehorse industry is all rosy and perfect, but a lot of people that are anti-racing have not seen it from start to finish.
Do you think one of the opportunities for helping all horses in all the various guises of the sport is to change or not help take a broader definition of welfare outside of academia? So the modern definitions of welfare encompass not just health, but the mental state of the animal, and it's a much broader way of thinking about welfare. But typically, many people, owners and riders, think mainly that health equals welfare. Would you agree?
I do,
Yeah.
and I do have a tendency to forget that not every horse owner would be able to give you a definition of animal welfare. It often gets mixed in with animal welfare, animal rights. So again, I get my students for 15 weeks, 3 times a week. So we're talking the entire semester about looking at the biological functioning part, the affective states, the nature of the animal. If I'm teaching an animal behavior and welfare class, we go through that. If I'm teaching our capstone class, we go back and revisit that. So that might be a place where if we could educate more of general horse lovers, that could be very valuable to understand more what this whole broad concept of animal welfare is.
I mean, going back to my introduction to animal welfare on my master's program, I went into that as a vet thinking, well, I know most of this stuff anyway, not realising that in my class of 30 there were maybe 4 vets. The rest, there was a couple of lawyers, there was people who'd worked in labs, people who had worked in zoos, people, there was a really wide variety of people who all brought different perspectives. And it really helped me realise that veterinary healthcare is only part of the story. Husbandry is only part of the story, although I personally think husbandry is a really, really important part of the story. And I suppose if someone said to me, what did you learn in your 3-year part-time degree, I would say that it's what the horse thinks about all this. That to me is the most important thing I've learned. And it took a long time for me to get to that place, but I'm much more aware of it now.
So one chapter of my PhD dissertation was on developing the animal welfare judging competition, which you may or may not have ever been exposed to. I worked with my professor, Eduardo Zanella, and we started that somewhere between 2000 and 2002. It's now gotten to be a very large competition, and there's a division for graduate students, veterinary students, undergraduate students, and it tends to be very interesting. A lot of the veterinary students will rank the health parameters really, really high, and some of the things that are trying to demonstrate how the animal feels about their situation get put down quite low. And then a lot of the undergraduates that might come from an animal science and management background, they might put those animal feelings real high and put some of the health measures lower. So that part has been really interesting. And when I do like working equid projects in developing parts of the world, I always have to kind of sit back and it's like, okay, this horse, this donkey, this mule, they're all really skinny, but my gosh, they're outside doing something with other equids for almost the entire day, and when they're not working, they're grazing. So their physical parameters are not amazing, but a lot of the other parts might put them out ahead of some of our high-level competition horses. So that makes my brain go a little crazy when I think about that.
Yeah, no, it is all fascinating. I've just started teaching some veterinary students and some animal science students, and I asked them that question at the start of the module. What's your kind of general worldview on animal welfare? And some say natural living, and some say function, and some say affective state. And then I asked them at the end of the course whether their view has changed, and it surprises me that some of it is just depending on their culture, their background, where they've grown up, what they've been exposed to. But it is a fascinating topic.
Yeah.
I'm really curious, Camie, you obviously had a bit of a front seat in terms of elite equestrian sport over the last few years with your role with the FEI. I'm just curious if you had your crystal ball, could you tell us what you think the worst case scenario might be, but also what you think the best case scenario might be for the future?
So I often see the world kind of through rose-colored glasses, is what I'm accused of. I believe that FEI and the national federations have, for the most part, started looking at this in time to not lose social license to operate. Certainly it needs some changes to happen, some improvements, more attention to the horse's perspective. But even though I was, there were times where I felt like, oh my gosh, are we ever going to get these folks to think more forward? You know, toward the end of our time period working with them, it's like, you know what? They're actually getting this. They are positive thinking. They want to save high-level sport. Now, high-level sport may gradually look different. There's a group in the United States, Western Dressage Association, that has moved toward having a lot of virtual competitions where you video your horse and you submit your test. I think that's kind of cool when you think of sustainability issues, when you think of not stressing the horse by moving. It would be interesting to see if some of the other lower level competitions might also go to that. And I don't mean that Western Dressage only has lower levels. I'm just saying it's something they've incorporated early on. I think it would be, I can't really imagine an FEI high-level show jumping to decide, okay, we're going to do this all through video submissions. So generally speaking, with our FEI and our national federations, I sort of feel like they've seen the light. They're trying to move forward. Yes, there are some smallish groups that are trying to put up obstacles. Smallish groups that are kind of fighting the evidence. But more and more people are saying, okay, we're not going to worry about that perspective. We're going to keep pushing forward. Again, there are certain areas of the horse industry that are 5 to 20 years behind, and some of those areas might not keep their social license.
I often hear the slippery slope argument. Oh, if we ban jump racing, well then flat racing's next. So if one of those smaller groups that are resistant to change, if they lose their social license, well then it's all over for all horse sport. How do you counter that argument?
That is a good question. I think each industry in question has to be given some analysis by multiple people that have the horse's welfare really at the heart of what they do. Trying to think of an example. At the risk of alienating somebody, I'm going to pick on calf roping at rodeos for a moment. If you do the older style jerk down calf roping, where the calf kind of half flips through the air after you rope it, if you take a naive person and they look at that, they're not necessarily going to be in love with that. But then if you show them some pictures of, okay, now here's breakaway roping, so we still want you to be able to rope the calf, but as soon as you get the calf, the rope breaks apart and the calf just gets to keep running. So in that term, rather than saying a slippery slope and just saying, okay, if we're not going to have one type of calf roping, we can't have any rodeo events at all. We're trying to look at the individual events and say, this one is kind of problematic. It ticks several boxes of negatively impacting calf welfare. But that doesn't mean we have to get rid of everything. I don't love this cliche of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but in some cases that's the situation. We can look at individual events and say, this event is not awesome. That doesn't mean that every rodeo event is a problem.
Yeah, and I think there's something about reluctance to change manifests itself as, oh, we can't touch the jerk down roping because then everything's going to go. It's almost a way of saying we're not changing, full stop. Whereas if they were open to changing that one small part of it, well, maybe the rest of it might be saved. So it's definitely worth thinking about.
But yeah, we've heard that slippery slope argument different times. Well, if you allow the option of one type of bridle, pretty soon it's going to mean you take away bridles completely, which certainly was never our intent. And yeah, my perfect world would have people that are more prepared to look at individual horse-human interactions, look at individual horse situations, horse competitions, and address each one to the standards that a lot of us that study this all the time can agree upon.
Do you think there's a likelihood if, for example, bit-free riding was allowed in high-level dressage, as an example, do you think that would see a shift towards, less severe bits, and as people could see that could be done successfully?
And that is definitely a hot topic issue. It's a little frightening to answer, if I'm honest.
Oh, you don't have to answer it.
No, I think the thing is we have a lot of criteria listed on how a dressage ride should be scored. If somebody is a good enough rider and has a good enough partnership or teamwork opportunity with their horse to go ahead and ride them bitless and have all the same criteria addressed, I personally think, why not have that option there? Now, there might be certain disciplines that the managing people say, all right, there's a little bit too much danger if we're doing high-level show jumping to let every single person ride bitless. Maybe they need to prove to us on a different course that they are safe when they ride bitless. Some of those things we need to navigate, and it may involve some people coming together, debating pros and cons, people that study the images of the horse, as well as people that ride at that kind of level. I don't ride Grand Prix dressage, but I still feel very comfortable assessing the welfare of a horse being ridden in Grand Prix dressage.
I guess where I was coming from was just, it's almost like you have to imagine it before something can happen. Do you know what I mean? Like if you just shut it all down and say, look, this is impossible, it will always remain impossible. And I really like your ideas of maybe people have to demonstrate that it's safe for them to ride without a bit, or things being put in place, checks and balances to ensure that it's good for everybody. You don't want to have to put other people at risk because you've got an out of control horse. But it's like you were saying, I think earlier, overcoming that, we've always done it this way, is really challenging. And yeah, so I was just kind of thinking, planting that seed of, well, if we just trial it or test it out or something, that's sort of, it's never going to happen if we just always say, well, no, it can't happen.
Right, and it would be really interesting to have that crystal ball. Look, 20 years from now, they might think this is the most ridiculous conversation because maybe everybody's riding bitless at that point. I don't personally have anything against well-fitted, well-used bits, but there are many things. 20 years previous, we didn't know how incredibly important awesome saddle fit was. Now we have a much better understanding of how many horses that are accused of being naughty are simply in pain because a saddle that's not fitting correctly.
And we didn't know the manifestations of pain, that the subtle manifestations of pain that we're aware of nowadays. I mean, there's so much progress has been made. We have a genie in the studio. I know it's a virtual studio, but there is a genie here, and she'll grant you one wish, anything you'd like, but it has to be connected to the future of horse sport. What would be your one wish for the future of horse sport?
And I actually already mentioned it. My one wish is that every single high-level competition horse gets outside to have some forage access, some friend access, at the very least an hour a day, preferably more.
Is there anything in our conversation today that you thought we would ask you, but we actually haven't? Any topic you thought we might cover that we actually didn't?
And I would actually say no. I had looked through your different emails. I had jotted down a few things to try not to forget. And yeah, I've ticked boxes on everything that I expected that you might ask. And I am accused often of having rose-colored glasses. I do think overall the horse industry is headed in a more positive direction than I've seen it in quite a while.
Speaking for myself, I'm absolutely delighted to hear you say that, because sometimes you can get bogged down in all the negativity, social media stuff. You just think, oh my God, what is going to happen? I mean, I've given my whole life to racing and breeding, and sometimes I do wonder, but so I'm really, really reassured to hear you say that. And I do think building people up and being supportive and showing them little nuggets of inspiration, or that gives them hope, I think is absolutely the way forward. And definitely not knocking will just make people more defensive.
Yeah, so we're keen to try and encourage people to ask their own questions and go looking for their own answers. And I think that's, for me personally, I think that's what I hope will lead to a better outcome for horses and for people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one thing I didn't remember to mention. As we enhance horse welfare, we almost always at the same time enhance human safety. And sometimes we forget about that piece. And it's very important. We're working with very large, incredibly strong animals with a strong panic mechanism. And the more we can think in terms of their welfare being positive, the more likely our safety is going to be good.
Yeah.
And I would add to that the more positive their welfare is, the better the human well-being is. I think being around happy horses is a recipe for happy people.
Absolutely.
I feel like that's a wonderful place to end up on today. I've really, really enjoyed our conversation, Camie, and thank you so much for taking time out of your, what I'm sure is a really busy day, to talk to us. So thank you so much.
And thanks for inviting me. This was fun.
Yes, thanks, Camie. I really enjoyed it, and I love your positivity. I want a pair of those rose-tinted spectacles.